Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and today we're focusing on the United States. What is Trump's legacy, and what can we expect from President Biden? My name is Jennifer Hudson. Welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. Joe Biden is president, Kamala Harris is vice president, and Donald Trump is out of office. The Senate and the House are both controlled by the Democrats, and a dramatic power shift is more or less complete. But the process of getting there has been fraught and potentially damaging for American democracy for years to come. So what are the repercussions of the last few weeks, and indeed the last 4 years, likely to be? And what will the presidency of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris bring? We explored such questions in November, when the votes were still being counted. But much has happened since then, and we thought in this inauguration week we should reconvene our US politics expert panel and scan the horizon once again. So I'm joined once more by Dr. Thomas Gift, Associate Professor of Political Science at UCL and Founding Director of the UCL Center on US Politics. By Dr. Julie Norman, Lecturer in Politics and International Relations and Co-Director of our Politics and International Relations undergraduate degree program. And Dr. Colin Provost, Associate Professor of Public Policy and Director of the MSc in Public Policy. Thomas, Julie, and Colin, welcome back to UCL Uncovering Politics. And I should say before we get going that we're recording this on the morning of the 18th of January. So the inauguration actually hasn't happened yet as we speak. We're assuming that it will happen, that US politics won't take an even darker turn. But you, dear listener, know that things that we don't, so forgive us if anything sounds out of date. Right, let's get started. Let's reflect on the impact of the events of the last few weeks. Last time we spoke in November, you were all optimistic that democracy in the US was resilient, and that once Trump was out of office, democratic norms would reassert themselves. Given all that has happened, do you remain so optimistic? Thomas, can I come to you first?
Well, certainly the events that we saw unfold at the Capitol were deeply disturbing because they cut at the heart of American democracy. But even despite those events, I guess I'm fundamentally still optimistic about democratic institutions and their health. Democracy is about norms, and they've certainly been tested, but they're also about institutional constraints and guardrails. And despite everything that Trump has done over the past 4 years, and also what he did to incite and encourage the violence that we saw at the Capitol, what's ensued since that period is probably what we should expect. The Congress did certify the Electoral College results. Trump has been impeached a second time, and Joe Biden will be inaugurated as president on January 20th. So institutional checks responded as they should. That seems to me the whole point of democracy when you have anti-democratic actors or actors who are acting in conflict with the basic thrust of institutions, that they push back, that they are durable. And I think by and large, that's what we've seen.
Julie, are you of a different view than you were back in November, having witnessed the events on the 6th of January in the Capitol?
Well, Jennifer, I'm mostly in agreement with Thomas. For me, as striking as all of the events on January 6th were, what was probably most notable was the fact that Congress did reconvene that night to certify the vote so that Biden will be inaugurated this week. And also, moreover, that for the 2 months before that, with over 60 different lawsuits and court challenges, multiple pressuring on different election officials, despite all those pressures, the system did hold and did not break. And I think, as Thomas said, that does underscore that institutions did hold when pressed. At the same time, though, I think all these events really underscore the precarity of democracy. A lot of those institutions held because certain individuals within them made a choice when it actually mattered, and they could have made other choices where things could have gone quite differently. And on the more longer term, the fact that about 70% of Republicans still think the election was stolen, I think shows that there are concerns moving forward with how the country views elections and views these institutions that may be held in this moment, but will lack trust going forward. And the last thing I guess I'd say is that many who were storming the Capitol that day, or at least present at the riot, thought that they were defending democracy. And so I think what we saw was not so much a rejection of democracy, but an exploitation of it by Trump over these last few months. And it's something that we need to be careful of and to see how our institutions can continue to weather moving forward.
That's really interesting, Julie. And I think we will talk about the future of the Republican Party and the large percentage of Republicans who view the actions in the Capitol as stopping the steal and saving democracy, as you put it. But I want to go to you, Colin, and pick up this idea of that Julie mentioned about institutions holding, not breaking. And that's true, but I mean, as Americans sitting here, that strikes us as a very different place to be here in 2021. That we're having that conversation in America about the robustness of our democratic institutions. How have you reflected on the past couple of weeks? Are you optimistic or pessimistic moving forward?
I remain cautiously optimistic, but I think that's a great point, and I agree with pretty much everything that Julie and Thomas said. One important point that Julie made was a lot of it came down to individual decisions. So we see what sort of institutional resilience there is there, partly as a result of individual decisions. So Brad Raffensperger, the Georgia Secretary of State, did not have to make the decisions that he did. He could have acquiesced to Trump. That probably would have then produced more lawsuits, and maybe it just would have strung things along, ultimately with the same result of Biden winning Georgia. But if you have enough people who decide they're going to, in power, who acquiesce to the notion of stopping the steal, then you're really, really testing the resilience of the electoral institutions at that point. So I think for me, with the ultimate backstop here was the courts quite often, right? When push came to shove, and when it came to, okay, present us with this evidence of electoral fraud, which you're talking about in the court of public opinion, which you're talking about in the legislative arena, in the actual judicial court is really where it mattered. And time and again, there was just nothing there. There was nothing to present. So I think courts were very important, and as long as the judges remained independent, no matter who they're appointed by, that's an important feature of the institutional resilience as well. And I know we'll come back to this, but the thing for me that matters here very much as well is the fact that before the Capitol riots, pretty much the entire American public knew who Donald Trump was deep down, right? And yet 74 million people voted for him, despite the anti-democratic tendencies. And this reflects something that UCL's own Brian Klass wrote in an op-ed in the Washington Post in December, talking about America's authoritarian voter problem. The demand for somebody who represents a strong man, not usually a strong woman, strong man in their particular case, right? Who's just going to get certain things done, no matter what happens to the process along the way. So we'll come to this more, but this presents really interesting questions for where the Republican Party goes from here, especially if Donald Trump ends up being convicted and is not able to run again in 2024.
Post 6th of January events, there's been a lot of talk in the US around coming together and the need to move on and heal. Is Joe Biden a president who is capable of this? Is America capable of this at this particular time? Julie.
Well, Jennifer, Biden certainly ran his campaign on this messaging of healing and unity. He's probably one of the best politicians positioned right now in Washington, I think, to assume office, given his background of bipartisan relationships in Congress, having relatively moderate stance, known for his empathy, drawing on his faith and whatnot. But what was already going to be an uphill battle for him, regardless, is now going to be even harder, I believe. There's sometimes a rallying effect after crisis, but so far the responses to the events on January 6th have been highly partisan, and moving into the impeachment as well, with over 85% of Democrats supporting it, over 85% Republicans not. It's going to be a very divisive time. And I also just think, it's going to be a long game for Biden moving forward to deal with these things. And it's also something he probably can't do alone. There are a lot of sectors that are reinforcing polarization in the United States right now, For Biden, I think his aim will just be try to de-escalate those tensions and try to keep at least a cap on more outright violence, if not being able to change all hearts and minds right away.
Thomas, Julie spoke there about, the conflict bearing out in the legislature, but thinking about where the American public are sitting, is there any sense from your view, watching US politics intimately over the last 6 months and a year, is there any sense that there's appetite for reconciliation and healing and a more center ground on the part of the US public?
The short answer is no. I'm very skeptical that healing can be achieved in the short term, at least by Joe Biden. I think if there is one politician who might be well suited to making incremental progress on this front, it's Biden. But it's unclear to me how that can happen in an environment where upwards of 80% or so of Republicans think that the 2020 election was illegitimate. I mean, the problem is that Donald Trump has really created this alternate reality for tens of millions of his supporters who are convinced by the falsehoods that the president has propagated. So I think that Biden can talk about healing and erasing divisions, but any change that's going to happen has to come from the inside. It basically has to come from within the Republican Party. I think one thing that we've seen from history is that accountability typically doesn't occur when members of opposing political movements sanction their adversaries. Instead, it occurs when that accountability comes from those within the movements, which places more of the responsibility, I think, going forward on the shoulders of mainstream Republicans.
That will take us into, I think, the Republican Party and what happens to it now post-Trump. And Colin, I want to come to you first on this. Thomas mentioned the idea that it's going to be for the Republican Party to sort itself out, to reassert itself back to the party of Reagan or the party of Bush, and leave behind that Trump Republican Party. Is that doable? Is there enough kind of old school Republicans left to reclaim the party?
I think it's going to be very difficult because the way the party has been working for the past 10, 15, even 20 years is that you've had Fox News and you've had talk radio and now social media where the tendency is to pull voters further to the right, and increasingly members of the House of Republican members of the House of Representatives, if they show bipartisanship or reach across the aisle, they're often accused of violating, I don't know, some sort of oath to the party, right? The ideological purity test, right? And so they then face a primary challenge from the right. So it's difficult for them to work in a bipartisan fashion, and so leaving Trump behind in a way is going to be difficult. I think with the upcoming impeachment trial, whenever that's going to be, we don't know exactly when it's going to be. It's a very interesting question whether or not there will be 17 Republican senators who decide that yes, Trump has to go because it's gone too far at this point. Or if they decide to let him hang around basically and have the possibility of running in 2024. But I think it makes it hard for the Republican Party to kind of move back to somewhere where there's a bipartisan effort. Partly because Mitch McConnell has shown that he doesn't really believe in not much anyway in bipartisan working together either. And so that's going to be very challenging for Joe Biden, especially as he tries to get his package passed early on. He has that Senate majority, but what he's proposing is pretty large, and Republicans will have problems with the level of spending, and he's going to face tests right away in 2022 if he doesn't achieve, bringing down the number of coronaviruses and re-stimulating the economy. If he doesn't do those things, he's definitely going to face a backlash at the midterm elections, which might be the thing that would happen anyway. But that's not going to help with healing, right? If people see that he's done a good job in helping with the coronavirus and the economy, then that will help. But it's a big challenge for the Republican Party as well to become the party of, as you said, Reagan or whoever they aspire to in their distant past.
Thomas, I want to come back to you on that question on the future of the Republican Party. Where does leadership come from for the Republican Party post-Trump? Are there any kind of emergent leaders that you see coming forward? Is there a sense that there is within the party now a kind of fight for the identity and the party that will emerge post-Trump?
I mean, you're seeing some struggles, but I think a lot of it is too little, too late. I mean, hopefully some of the narrative changes once Donald Trump actually leaves office. Ultimately, the role for the Republican Party is not just to say that Donald Trump isn't the future. I think it's to actually articulate a positive vision that gives voters a reason to support them, that doesn't write off cities, that doesn't write off huge swaths of minority voters, that doesn't make false promises, that doesn't position itself, I think, primarily as the party of no. I think it has to make a case for traditional conservative principles that have been a recipe for success in the past: free markets, free people, civil liberties, not just in abstract terms, but I think in real terms with respect to how that plays out in individual lives. I mean, as you noted, in the 1980s, the Republican Party was really the party of ideas. I think it has to get back to being the party of ideas on immigration, healthcare, the environment. And I think that that's important for Republicans, but everyone, regardless of where you stand politically, should be invested in the health of a center-right party in the United States. Because if there's one thing that we know, it's that no side of the political spectrum has a monopoly on what correct policy is. And both sides, the left and the right, can have tendencies at various points to veer off the tracks. And so it's essential for both sides to be functional. And unfortunately, right now, one side is just totally not functional.
Let's look ahead to the trial of Trump in the Senate. Julie, how do you foresee that happening? Does it matter that Trump is convicted, or is it simply enough for America kind of to recover, to have the trial, to have the process go forward? Where do you see that happening? What do you see happening in that process?
Well, Jennifer, I think for Democrats, it was both of those things. It's true that the impeachment trial, however warranted, will be divisive, as we mentioned before. If he's convicted, Trump supporters will probably see him as a martyr. If he's acquitted, he'll probably be seen as a hero. But for Democrats, the idea was that to not have a trial would also be quite divisive, and to not have any attempt at accountability or to leave things open to impunity would also be divisive. So I think that combined pragmatically with the slim but the real chance of potentially barring Trump from future office is what pushed the impeachment trial forward. I agree, though, that I think getting 17 Republican senators, to join Democrats to convict is going to be very difficult. A lot, I think, will rest on current Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, what he decides to do on that, and if his leadership will inspire others to break rank with Trump or not. But I do think that's going to be an uphill battle. And even if they do get the conviction, we can probably expect legal challenges on the constitutionality of the trial from Trump and his team that could possibly take it all the way to the Supreme Court. So in short, I think the impeachment was kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't. I think if what happened on January 6th was just left out there, that would have left the country quite rent. But moving forward, the impeachment is also going to create some real challenges in the short term, but also even for the longer term for Biden as well.
Colin, I want to pick up on that same question with you. What's your view on how that will play out, both I think in terms of the actual politics in Washington, D.C., but within polarization in the U.S. electorate? I mean, sitting where we are now, it's difficult to think that it can get much more polarized. But we've learned over the last 12 months that things can get worse than we think they are. How do you think the trial will play out?
Well, it seems to me that it presents different dilemmas for each party, right? So for Joe Biden, he really wants the focus to be on getting his cabinet nominees get confirmed as quickly as possible, and then looking at judicial seats as well, since he's nominated Merrick Garland, a current judge, to be his attorney general. He's got a very ambitious agenda that he wants to get on with really quickly, and an impeachment trial is about as big an obstruction as you could ask for in terms of putting it right in front of that agenda. So, they've spoken about, we can do both things at the same time, which maybe seems a little unrealistic. Or there was some whispers a week ago of doing it several weeks into the future. By then, maybe people will have forgotten about it. Not forgotten, but it's unclear whether there'll be the same appetite for it. So it looks at this point like somehow Chuck Schumer and many of the Democrats are going to be working in overdrive, right? Trying to confirm nominees and run an impeachment trial at the same time, which it's not clear how that's going to work. I think for the Republicans, though, this is, as my understanding is that if they convict, right, then they could have a short vote afterwards in the Senate to vote whether or not Donald Trump should be allowed to run for office again, like separately. And if he was convicted, we can assume that, yes, that would pass as well. He would be barred from ever running for office. It really, I think it comes down to what the Republicans want to do here. And it's a very difficult decision for them. As I understand it, Mitch McConnell is kind of sitting back and letting them mull it over, perhaps in their minds right now. But if if Trump is still around in the next 4 years and can potentially run again, that's the odds are good that he may be back in 2024. So given what has happened, and that some people, despite being on board with everything up until January 6th, some Republicans being on board with everything up until January 6th, now suddenly see it as a step too far. Some of them have decided, yeah, okay, now it's too much and we can't have this again. So it's really interesting to see how Republicans are going to vote in this Senate impeachment trial. And I can't pretend to know how many of the rank and file senators are going to fall in line. I mean, I looked through the list of senators yesterday and I surmised that maybe 10 of them would vote to convict. But many of them, there's still really no basis to say that they would vote to convict at this point, given how in line they've been with Trump's agenda over 4 years.
Before we turn and look at the Biden presidency and what we might be able to expect from a Biden-Harris administration, I want to, round this out by asking each of you, what does Trump do next? Where does Trump go? Assuming he's not convicted, and he has the opportunity to run again in 2024, does he? Would he? Does he have the ambition? Has he been there, done that, and will look on to do something else? But what do you think he does immediately, and how do you think he will be in U.S. politics, if at all, post the Biden inauguration? Thomas?
Well, I think that the lesson with Donald Trump is that you can't rule anything out, because time after time after time, he has totally exceeded expectations and confounded experts. I think if Trump's eligibility to run in 2024 remains intact, that will definitely allow him to loom very large over the Republican Party for the next 4 years if he wants to. And in some respects, Trump is most effective at playing this Washington outsider. And the risk is that he could do a lot of damage, again, if he wants to, agitating while out of office. Of course, he could do that whether he's convicted in a Senate trial or not, but I think his clout will be much greater if his supporters think that there is at least a possibility of him running for the White House again. Certainly, the social media bans will curtail his voice, at least in the short term. But does anybody really think that if Donald Trump wants to have an audience, he's not going to have an audience? I don't. He'll find ways to circumvent that and speak directly again to his supporters without the filter of the quote unquote mainstream media. So Donald Trump will, I think, cast a really long shadow over the Republican Party for the next 4 years, whether he wants to run or not. And I tend to think that he will at least keep that possibility open as long as possible, even if he ultimately decides that he's going to hand over the reins to someone else. But I think that the role that Donald Trump will play can be considerable.
Julie, any disagreement from you?
I would agree with that pretty much 100%. I mean, for Trump, again, we can only pretty much expect him to be somewhat unpredictable and not always know his next moves. I agree that whether he actually intends to run or not in 2024, him keeping that option open and making it seem as that being a strong possibility definitely gives him a lot of political capital moving forward, even after he's left office. And he can wield that pretty much however he wants, whether that's in the midterms and supporting different candidates or pushing for different causes. He will still have some kind of following, diluted a little bit after he leaves office, of course, but we've seen in recent polls that more are identifying as Trump supporters than Republicans in some polls. So he will still have that following moving forward, which I think is notable. And again, whether he's barred from office or not, he will still have a strong grip, a loosening grip, but a strong grip on the party. And I'll be curious to see how we've seen different the business sector is starting to pull back on contributions and stuff on Trump and Trump supporters and whatnot. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the future as well. But in terms of a personality, he still will have that going for him no matter what.
Colin, I want to come to you as we pivot and start talking about the Biden presidency. When we spoke in November, the expectation was that the Republicans would retain control of the Senate and would therefore significantly constrain Biden's legislative agenda. How big of a difference do the Georgia results make for Biden's ability to pursue his legislative agenda?
Well, it makes a significant difference because now I should say it makes a significant difference for certain things, right? So he should be able to get most of his cabinet picks through now. It was, if you notice, he actually waited until January 7th to announce a number of his different nominations. So it implies that he probably had two lists: one if the Democrats didn't win both seats, and one if they did win both seats. And he went with maybe his first choices because the Democrats did win both seats. So he's got his cabinet picks to make. Merrick Garland, his pick for Attorney General, comes from the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the second most powerful court. And now he can pick somebody to replace Garland that he would want, whereas before he would have been very reluctant to pick Garland without a Senate majority, because it's not clear that Mitch McConnell would have allowed any judicial picks to get through. So now they can make judicial picks as well, in addition to getting his cabinet nominees through. That makes a big difference for his larger policy packages, like his 1.9 trillion relief stimulus package. The narrow majority does not make as big a difference on that front, right? Because for that kind of bill, ideally you would need 60 votes, right, to get past the threat of a filibuster. There's the procedure of saying, okay, we're going to vote on this as a budget reconciliation tool, which says you only need a simple majority, but that limits what you can put in the bill. And that also goes against what Biden has said, right? Biden has not boasted, but he has said that he's going to, in addition to healing, he's going to work in a bipartisan way. He's going to reach out to his Republican colleagues, and he seems to think he can bring several on board, right? So there'll of course be a lot of negotiations with this package. It's not going to be what he's just proposed. It's going to be something more slimmed down than that, certainly. But I would basically say that having the Senate majority matters for a lot of his nominees, for getting judges through, for getting smaller scale things through. Really large scale programs is still going to be a struggle, but he'll still have more support than he would have without those two seats.
Thomas, we've heard a lot about a Biden administration signing back up to the Paris Agreement on the first day, using a lot of executive authority to reverse some of the actions that Trump has taken, and ambitions to do 100 million vaccinations in the first 100 days. How likely is he to be successful in his ambitions, given where the public are at, given the divisiveness he's going to face? But more generally, what do you think we're going to see from a Biden administration in policy terms?
Well, I think that Joe Biden will be able to sign these executive orders. That's well within his purview. And so rejoining the Paris Climate Accords, for example, that's something that will happen. As Colin said, however, when it comes to policy legislation, there's still going to be a fair amount of resistance in the Senate. Unless you have 60 votes, a lot of these legislative ambitions are going to get significantly watered down by Republicans. And so even with both houses of Congress, it will be an uphill battle on the COVID relief package. For example, Biden has proposed a $1.9 trillion stimulus with $1,400 checks for Americans. He probably will get something through, but it's going to be much less than he actually wants at the outset. And so, in this environment, it's going to be very difficult for him to govern. Of course, that's the case for any president. And by and large, I think it's going to depend on what issues he chooses to prioritize. Clearly, he is constrained to some extent during these first 100 days because just by virtue of the situation that he has inherited, he's going to have to focus so much on COVID. And he has inherited a really incompetent response, I think, in many respects from the prior administration. So if he does that well, then maybe he will get what essentially amounts to a de facto second 100 days. If he hobbles out of the gate, then I think that can really leave this administration with very few signature legislative accomplishments. But much of that is still to be determined.
Julie, switching gears a little bit and looking at the choices that Biden's made for his cabinet, what can we learn from those choices?
Well, Jennifer, we've seen a lot in Biden's choices in terms of diversity of his picks. It's one of the most diverse cabinets in history. But I think more importantly, or just as importantly, is the fact that Biden has chosen a team that is very experienced, very competent, and also with those who he has very close working relationships, especially with his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. He's chosen a Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, who is former head of the Federal Reserve, a defense chief, the first African-American defense secretary who he worked with closely during the Obama administration. So I think we see Biden doing what he pretty much said he would do, opting for stability and competence over more grand visions, opting for more trust and reliability over, say, a team of rivals approach. It's true that some of his picks are probably too liberal for some on the right, or probably not liberal enough for some progressives on the left, but it's mostly a team that, when taken together, reflects Biden's own relative moderation and pragmatism.
Colin, what do Biden's picks tell us about, I think, the difference between, looking back at the kind of people that Trump had in the cabinet? Is this a repudiation of the anti-science, anti-expert appointments that Trump made?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, 100%. I mean, not just anti-science, but we talked about democratic norms as well. And part of that is also, I would say, Biden really has respect for bureaucratic norms. So he is certainly not going to treat Merrick Garland like his own personal attorney. He's going to let the Department of Justice operate with the autonomy that it's traditionally been blessed with, even though it's an executive agency. And so he's not going to be, and not, even Merrick Garland is not going to be interfering as much with the work of career prosecutors in the Department of Justice as Bill Barr did when he was Attorney General. So there's more respect for bureaucratic norms. There's much more respect for science, and I would say that Julie's point is right as well about there being moderation. So there's kind of a, Biden has sought out like the old hand of experience with a lot of his picks. So he's picked David Kessler, former FDA commissioner under George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, to oversee the manufacture and distribution of COVID vaccines, right? And so this is an appointment where somebody is kind of seen as a trusted old hand. But in other areas, he's shown that he's very serious about social justice, environmental justice, right? And his environmental picks show this. With Michael Regan, African American head to be the head of the EPA, Deb Haaland, the Native American tapped to be the head of the Interior, and Jennifer Granholm, who's been a strong advocate for clean energy. She's tapped to head the Department of Energy now, and Pete Buttigieg in transportation. So you take these people together, it's a very serious statement about not just rejoining the Paris Climate Accord, but about the commitment to it that's going to come from that as well. And also the idea that environmental justice and it needs to be something that's baked into what the administration does completely, with seeing the race angle with the environment as well, and also trying to get most agencies to think about climate change and what they do, not just those that are specifically tasked with looking at those agencies.
I want to bring us to a close, focusing on Kamala Harris. We are a few days away from the inauguration of the first female vice president of the United States, a woman of color. Thomas, what role will Kamala Harris play in the next 4 years?
I wouldn't necessarily expect her to be a particularly powerful or unpowerful vice president. I think it's hard to know at this point. I think that her role could evolve, though, over time. And the primary factor there is whether Joe Biden signals an interest in running for a second term. I think he'll wait as long as possible. But if he suggests that he's not going to do that, then she becomes one of the main contenders, if not kind of the heir apparent for the presidential spot for the Democratic Party. And that elevates her role significantly. But everything that I've seen to this point, vice presidents often don't play a huge role. In some sense, a lot of their responsibilities are symbolic and to support the president. And I would expect something similar from Kamala Harris.
Do you think, Julie, that there's an opportunity here, taking Thomas's point that vice presidents haven't been particularly kind of at the front or particularly powerful in terms of their actual authority? Is there something symbolic about her role that might yield more power than she would have formally?
Well, certainly for Kamala Harris, the first female vice president, the first woman of color, the daughter of immigrants, her story is one that's certainly inspiring to many, not just in the party, but also just in an increasingly diverse country. And I think she will be a good complement to Biden in terms of finding both language as well as policy priorities for an increasingly multi-ethnic democracy. And we know that that's one of his goals, is to be able to lean into that a little bit more. But I also just think, just on her own merits, she will be a potentially strong figure in the administration. Like Thomas said, will be interesting to see her define that role. But Biden has said, just as he was to Obama, that she will be the last person in the room with him on major decisions. We already know that she's going to have the pragmatically powerful role of being the tiebreaker in the Senate. So she is positioned to be having influence, at least on some big issues. And again, personally, I think that'll be up to her to carve out her exact role. And also, as Thomas alluded to, Biden's own trajectory and what that means for Kamala Harris by extension.
Colin, just to round off with you, Julie mentioned the role that she will play in the Senate. How do you see that being meaningful? How do you think she'll occupy that role?
Well, I suppose, she'll be there when, you're expected to have very close votes, right? And she'll be there to preside over the Senate whenever that's seen as necessary. So that is going to be an important role symbolically, but also just for getting the job done there. I agree with Thomas that it's I agree with both Thomas and Julie that it's difficult to say what role she's going to occupy precisely, right? Because the role of vice president is so often kind of elastic, and we've seen examples where some vice presidents are just token positions, and others who use it to become very powerful, like Dick Cheney under George W. Bush. So I do think that I would agree with Julie and Thomas that she is not a token pick by any means, right? She was picked both for what she represents and in terms of who she speaks to, who she represents in the country, but also in terms of her competence, right, and what she brings to the job as a former attorney general, former senator, former prosecutor, all these things, right? So I do think she will have a strong voice on most of the major policy issues. She's not going to be somebody that's frozen out of these issues, and so. Where she then ends up spending a lot of her time, right, where she kind of goes in deep, I think is probably the mystery to figure out like where she's going to be spending a lot of time, or if she's going to have to find a way to spread herself thin across many different policy issues. But I do think as well, there's something to the idea that Biden will benefit from making her the representative or the ambassador to many issues and putting her out there to represent the administration and talk about what the administration is doing on any number of issues, really.
Thank you all for a fascinating discussion and quite a lot of insight into what's happening in US politics. Dare I say, we might be here again in a couple of months' time talking about Biden's first 100 days and what we've learned from this new administration and where we find the US at in terms of its democratic politics. So thank you very much to Thomas Gift, Julie Norman, and Colin Provost. US politics is set to remain fascinating over the coming years. And as I said, I hope to have you back very, very soon. Next week, we're joined by Dr. Jeffrey Howard. Jeff is going to be speaking about the limits of free speech on social media, topical in this particular period in light of Trump's Twitter ban, moves against Parler, and other recent developments. Remember to make sure that you don't miss out on future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics. All you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Spotify, or whatever podcast provider you use. I'm Jennifer Hudson. Our producer is Abby Turner. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you very much for listening.